So I want to start with the case for Jesus Christ as the resurrected Son of God.
There's three ways we can approach it. On the Shroud of Turin, there is truly scientifically accessible evidence for the resurrection as well.
What you're saying is we have remnants of Jesus' resurrected body on the Shroud of Turin.
Literally, Jesus is leaving us the particles of his body embedded in the cloth, which has produced this picture.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lila Rose podcast. This episode is coming out on Holy Thursday, the beginning of what is called the Easter Triduum, the 3 days leading up to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Christians all over the world are celebrating these very holy days. This episode is really special because we're going to be talking about the evidence and the science for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Listen, Jesus Christ's resurrection is, of course, a deeply held belief, a passionate matter of faith for millions, billions of Christians worldwide. But the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not solely a belief. It is a matter of scientific evidence and historical record. And today we have on renowned physicist, philosopher, and priest, Father Robert Spitzer, the author of many books. He's the former president of Gonzaga University. He's also the head of the Magis Institute. And Father Spitzer has spent decades studying the science and the evidence behind the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You will find his commentary fascinating. I was especially blown away by the commentary from Father Robert Spitzer in the latter half of our interview, where he discusses the Shroud of Turin, which is a real cloth from almost 2,000 years ago that was wrapped around Jesus Christ, and the historical evidence for that fact, along with the scientific evidence that shows that, yes, Jesus Christ resurrected, his body resurrected from the Shroud of Turin. For those who are observing Good Friday, the Passion of our Lord, this episode will also give you great food for thought and meditation about what Jesus Christ suffered, as the Shroud of Turin reveals truly what our Lord endured for the salvation of souls. Enjoy this episode and have a very blessed Easter. Father Spitzer, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, it's always great to be with you, Lila. Thank you.
I'm so delighted you're back. You were a big hit on our conversation about science and God, science and faith.
Much more to go on that.
Yes.
I think we can explore it a little more deeply today, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. We're going to get into miracles, the evidence for Christ's resurrection.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But first of all, for people who don't know you yet, who is Father Robert Spitzer?
Well, I'm a Jesuit priest. I'm the president of the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. And that, if I might shamelessly advertise, is magiscenter.com, M-A-G-I-S center.com, where we have loads and loads of free videos, free articles on all the topics we're discussing today. And so if people want to go there or get some, modules for their high school or middle school kids, they're there. It's free of charge. 90% of the website is free of charge. And so I would just beg you to take a look at it. I have 18 books, but I'm not selling them right now. But a lot of them concern faith and science, and a lot of them concern happiness and philosophy of culture and a variety of other things. We do, a lot of things, like, especially we have a high school and a middle school program that we bring out through Sophia Institute for Teachers, and it's called the Catholic Faith and Science. This is a senior elective for Catholic high schools, and we have a moral apologetics one. Why in the world does the Catholic Church's morality, especially on the controversial issues, make sense? So we have a whole program on that for the second semester elective, and that comes, if you just go to Sophia Institute for Teachers, you can see that program there. Any high school that wants it, I'm happy to talk to people, teachers, about it, or bringing it onto your diocese if you're part of a diocese. And obviously we're very anxious, too, to bring our middle school curriculum called Speak the Faith to the kids. That's really about faith and science as well, so that they can be equipped to defend their faith when they're going to be challenged by it in the secular community.
Awesome. And you were also the president of Gonzaga University
Yes,
at
I
one
was.
point, and then you're also a physicist.
I'm a philosophy of science guy, but my emphasis is physics. So I come at philosophy of science from space-time and gravitational theory rather than from quantum theory, which is another approach. I'm on the physics side of things. There are very good philosophy of science guys in biology, like good Dr. Dan Keebler and so forth. But that's where I make my approach. And so I do sneak a few little aspects of physics into my talks and hopefully don't go over too many people's heads.
I think there's some of it went over my head a few times when I was surveying some of your books. But how does I didn't get to ask you this last time, but I had people asking in the comments and people asking me to ask you, how does a priest acquire so much, not just education, but focus so much on teaching? I mean, you've written 18 books. You have all this, you mentioned the curriculum, the Magis Center. What is that? How does that work?
Well, the Jesuits have a little word, which our institute's named after, called Magis, and it means the even more. And so when Ignatius got going, he said there are 3 questions that every Jesuit ought to concern himself with. Number 1, what is the greatest universal need for the kingdom of God? Well, faith and science is one such need. The second question he had was, is anybody else doing it well in the church? And there are some people doing it, but we desperately need a whole lot more. And because it is the number one reason why our kids are dropping out at almost 50% are dropping out of the Catholic Church simply because they think that faith and science contradict or that there's no evidence for God whatsoever from a scientific perspective. So I thought, wow, greatest universal need? No problem. That's the faith and science question. Number 2, is anybody else doing it? Very, very little at the time when I started getting into it as a graduate student for my PhD in philosophy of science and metaphysics. So then the third question is well, can you do something about it? Can you do something more that's not being done? And my answer was so resoundingly yes. Once I finished my term, I spent 11 years as president of Gonzaga. Once I was done with it, I basically told my friend Tim Bush, I'm coming down in your direction, and my objective is to start this institute dedicated to faith and science and faith and reason in general, contemporary arguments and things for God and Jesus. So I decided to come down here, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wonderful, wonderful history. Every morning when I wake up, I love to make myself a steaming cup of 7 Weeks coffee. 7 Weeks coffee is gourmet, small batch, low acid, ethically sourced coffee that is absolutely delicious. I love the Burundi blend and the Ethiopian medium blend. So many different choices at 7weekscoffee.com. What I love about 7 Weeks Coffee is not just that it's delicious coffee delivered right to my door, but that 7 Weeks Coffee fuels the pro-life movement. In fact, 7 Weeks' mission is to give 10% of all of its revenue, not just its profits, directly to support pregnancy resource centers. In fact, 7 Weeks Coffee has already supported 800 pregnancy resource centers, helping moms and babies in need, and donated over $325,000. At 7weekscoffee.com today, you can join the Heartbeat Club, where you can get the lowest prices and the best discounts on your monthly subscription. You'll get 15% off a month, and when you use my code Lila at checkout, you'll get an additional 10% for 25% off your first order. So go to 7weekscoffee.com today, order yourself an amazing subscription of coffee, try out your favorite blend, and get 25% off your first order by using the code Lila at checkout. Okay, so we're going to talk about the resurrection. And when I was discerning or determining if I had any sort of religious identity as a young, not rebellious, but certainly exploring teenager, I was raised in an evangelical home, but I decided, okay, I don't know what I believe. There are some things that kind of questioned or challenged my parents', I guess you could say, faith to me. And so I was trying to discover, what do I believe? Started surveying religion, started to try to understand history, tried to understand what I was being taught, why this, why that, and came back to the person of Jesus Christ as certainly the most consequential figure in human history and the most evidenced, you could argue, figure in human history. So I want to start with that. The case for not just Jesus Christ as a historical figure, that's easy. That's an easy one. But the case for Jesus Christ as, yes, the resurrected Son of God.
Yes, there's three ways we can approach it. The first way is what I might call the more traditional arguments. That's like taking St. Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 15, where he sets up basically a dialectic, a dilemma of sorts. And he says, look, I'm going to tell you right now, the resurrection is the central doctrine. If Jesus is not risen from the dead, then our preaching is in vain, your faith is worthless, and all those who have died in Christ have died in their sins. And what's more, we emerge as perjurers before God, and the worst of all men. So, he's saying the consequences are horrible. But let's dissect that for just a moment. And Paul, St. Paul, very good legal arguments. So he basically says, let's suppose for a moment that I'm really not a religious person. I'm lying about God. I'm lying about the resurrection of Jesus only because I want personal prestige for myself. So he says, let's suppose I really don't believe in God. He says, well, then why would I be doing this? Because by lying about the resurrection and lying about the true identity of Jesus as the Son of God, I'm being persecuted day in and day out. Why am I being thrown out of this town? Why am I being thrown into the Colosseum and tortured? Why am I fighting the beast at Ephesus? Why is all this happening to me? I may as well, if I don't believe in the resurrection, if the resurrection is a big lie, and I've been lying about it, why don't I just eat, drink, and be merry? For tomorrow I'm going to die. Why would I endure this persecution? That doesn't make any sense at all. So let's suppose that I do believe in God, and I'm lying about the resurrection. Paul's already got the answer to it. He says, well, if I did believe in God and I'm lying about the resurrection, then I'm a perjurer before God. And not just me, but all these other witnesses. And he gives this big list of witnesses, right? First he appears to Peter, then to the 12, then to 500 of the brethren all at once, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then he appeared to all of the apostles. These are the missionary apostles in the Jerusalem area. And finally, he appears to me as one born out of due course. Now, why would all those people who obviously believe in God be lying about the resurrection? Because if they're perjurers before God and their lie is leading people away from the people of God in Judaism and leading them to this new group called Christianity on the basis of a lie, if you really believed in God, hey, you are the worst of all people, as Paul says. Not only the worst of all people, but you deserve to be punished as someone who undermined the authentic kingdom of God with your lie. And Paul says, why would I want to do that? Why would any of these other witnesses want to do that?
And when you mentioned these witnesses, you mentioned up to 500 witnesses.
Yeah.
These are people who witnessed in physical body the resurrection.
Yes,
Christ.
absolutely.
They saw Jesus after he came. He resurrected from the dead.
Absolutely. There's not a single exegete that I know outside of a few really radical exegetes that would deny that this is not just some feeling of Jesus or something of that nature, a Skilobexian proposition or something. They really saw him. They were gathered together. They're gathered together, very probably in Galilee, as a very large group of individuals. Some people conflate it with the Holy Spirit event, but it is not the Holy Spirit event. It is a resurrection event of Jesus. Paul intends it in this way. And if you know the Greek terms for appearance and saw, there can be no doubt Paul means it in the very physiological seeing sense. By the way, would it make any sense at all, honestly, Lila, if, to say, oh, they didn't physically see him, but 500 still got the appearance. So God had to give 500 different rays to each individual, 500 different subjective like appearances. I mean, of course, the only way of objectively seeing something together is to see it physically through your eyes and experience it as a group. End of story. Paul couldn't have meant anything else other than that. And that's why you have such a large group to begin with, the starter group, as it were, for the apostles. The Jerusalem church and the Galilean church did not grow simply on the words of the apostles. 12 people saw them and so forth. Yes, 12 people saw Jesus first, but those apostles. But then what do? They go out and gather a bunch of people. And when they're gathering a bunch of people and they're all there together, maybe in Galilee, that's what a lot of exegetes think, then of course Christ appears, and he appears transformed. He appears looking like God. He appears so much that when Matthew describes the scene in his gospel on a hilltop in Galilee, he says, and when Jesus appeared, they all bowed down and worshiped, all of them. Now, he doesn't say the number like Paul does, but of course the implication is the first thing they see is something that makes them worship. And then now let's go back to Matthew's gospel. When does Matthew talk about worship? Right at the beginning of his gospel. So he's doing, almost like a closure statement. Right at the temptations of Jesus, the devil comes and says, worship me, and I'll give you all of this. And then, of course, Jesus responds, no. You shall worship the Lord your God alone. Him alone shall you serve. Now, him alone shall you serve. Now, you look at that. Him alone shall you serve. The idea of the using worship in that context and then turning around, and in your last statement in the gospel, you say they all bowed down in worship. They thought they were seeing God. And by the way, that's verifiable through John's gospel and Luke's gospel, and I can explain that if you want in a second. But the main point I'm getting is these 500, they're seeing this transformed Jesus. Then, there's always this thing, though some doubted, says Matthew. Well, they couldn't be doubting that something very powerful and godlike is appearing if they're all collectively worshiping him. What are they doubting? Is that divine appearance, that theophany, is that Jesus? And of course, the next thing you see is that Jesus is basically revealing himself to them. Now, in Luke's gospel and John's gospel, it's by the wounds of the crucifixion. However, in Matthew's gospel, not so. In Matthew's gospel, it is the mission. So Jesus then gives them the Great Commission, as you know. He says, full power and authority. There you go again, a divine analogy. Full power and authority in heaven and earth has been given over to me. So if you didn't get the worship analogy, Matthew's drawing the line underneath the second reference. Full power and authority has been given over to me. So they're witnessing somebody who has full power and authority. God and God alone. So he's appearing like God. Then he says, go therefore and teach them everything. Who? I told you. Well, who did? That's Jesus. All of a sudden, aha. So now they know through the commissioning itself and then, baptize them and, know that I will be with you always until the end of the age. Okay, so the idea, though, is clearly Jesus not only appears, he appears with a kind of looking like a theophany, a divine apparition, but of course, he's continuous with his body. Of course, he's still got the wounds of crucifixion in that continuous body, which comes out much more clearly in Luke and in John. But nevertheless, by the time you're done, I think Matthew describes the 500 pretty much, in one fell swoop and what happened. And it seems to me that that's very plausible on the mountain in Galilee.
So you're speaking to witness accounts, basically. Witness accounts that are documented by multiple gospel writers, and then there's other documentation beyond the Gospels, beyond the Bible, for the historicity of Christ pre-resurrection, the crucifixion of Christ actually being crucified, and then appearances of Jesus Christ post-resurrection.
Right.
So you have all of that. Now, there's some people who will say, okay, witnesses, schmitnesses, I don't buy it, give me something more. Give me something more for how we know that Jesus Christ, sure, he existed. Yeah, okay, I'll give you that historically, but that he resurrected from the dead.
Okay, the second approach is what I call the N.T. Wright approach. N.T. Wright, as you may know, is a historical exegete, very brilliant man, also a bishop in the Anglican Church, but a first-class historical exegete. Wright wrote 2 books called Jesus and the Victory of God, as well as The Resurrection of the Son of God. I'm just going to give you very briefly 2 of his arguments, and then, it's a second approach, very persuasive to a lot of intellectuals, and brought around a lot of former atheists as well. But the first approach that Wright has is what we would call today a historical anomaly. So in other words, you look at what Wright did was he looked at all the messianic movements that took place about 100 years before Jesus and 100 years after Jesus. There's one basic commonality between all of them, except for Christianity. The commonality is, for all the other messianic movements, 50 years after that Messiah has been persecuted, what happens? The messianic movement, including the movement of the Baptist, dies out. It's gonzo. 50 years, no more. Now you get to Jesus. What happens with Jesus? It's totally different. It's just like Jesus, the Jesus movement, right? Jesus as risen, Jesus as Lord, grows exponentially in the face of the humiliating death of its Messiah. We know this as a fact because in 200 years, the Roman Empire, which was persecuting this little teeny Christian church, is suddenly taken over by the church it was persecuting. And you look at that, and that's got to require an exponential increase. So,
is there any other religion, Father, that this has existed, where there's a persecuted, destroyed remnant, including the Savior or the God himself, and then out of that, all of a sudden, they take over, not by the sword, mind you, but by true conversion and suffering?
That is true. I mean, 240 years of persecution later, and all of a sudden, whammo, Edict of Milan. You look at this, and it's the most extraordinary thing. But all the while the church is being persecuted, it's exponentially growing.
And to be clear, the Edict of Milan, sorry to interrupt here, but just for people listening, the Edict of Milan was not convert or thou shalt die. This wasn't some sort of Islamic rule of saying you must convert or die. It was merely saying we are now authorizing this religion officially.
That's right, an Edict of Toleration. And then, of course, right after the Edict of Toleration, Christianity was so powerful. It just became the religion of the Roman Empire. And so you look at it, and it's very peaceable, no violence. In fact, the violence is suffered by the Christians, not vice versa. That's a huge difference. The second thing that's really, really important here is that, John P. Meyer, another really a Catholic, excellent historical exegete, they all ask the same question. The foremost historical exegetes in the Catholic Church. And you ask, what's the question? Well, why? Why? How can you explain this? Every other, a Messianic movement died in 50 years. Just dead array. And here we are, 240 years later, being actively persecuted the entire time. And, of course, the entire Roman Empire becomes Christian. There's got to be some reason. Number one, resurrection. The first thing is, they are not a discouraged group of people. They're not a group of people going, well, I guess he was the one, right? Like at Emmaus when they're walking, together, Cleopas and the other stranger. We thought he was the one. We were hoping, but that's not the rhetoric. The rhetoric is he's risen as he promised, and he has appeared to Simon. The second thing is those apostles are preaching, right, Jesus Christ risen from the dead. And what's going on while they're preaching? They are performing miracles day in and day out by the Holy Spirit in the name of Jesus. Now, wait a minute, people are going to think to themselves, if we're lying about the resurrection, if we're lying about the lordship of Jesus, if we're lying about Jesus' life and times, if we're basically lying about all of this, would you mind telling me why God, his Father, would perform a whole set of miracles, raisings of the dead, healing the blind, etc., day after day through the hands of these liars who are literally healing in the name of the person they're lying about? That's like accusing Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. It's laughably, intrinsically contradictory.
As I've shared on the show before, I'm very picky about my skincare routine. In fact, I've tried many products over many years and never landed on a product line, a brand that I really love. And then I discovered NimiSkincare.com. That's Nimi Skincare.com. Nimi Skincare is a company that shares our values. It's pro-family and pro-life, but it also is a high-quality, clean skincare brand based on decades of research. They use clinically proven ingredients, and they've got incredible products. Go to NimiSkincare.com today. Check out their lines. I love how simple the products are to use. I love that the ingredients are clean. I really enjoy the hydration cream as well as their brightening sunscreen that I use every single day. I know you or the woman in your life will love their products. So go to NimiSkincare.com today. Use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. That's NimiSkincare.com, and you can use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. When you speak of these miracles after the resurrection performed by the followers of Jesus Christ as part of his command to them to go out and make disciples, and then in that process they're doing these miracles in his name that are helping people come to belief. You know, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Is there evidence of those miracles? How do we know that those really happened?
Because it's not just because of the testimony in the scriptures, right? From the Acts of the Apostles, etc., or from Paul's words himself. When I came to you guys, you were a bunch of nothings. But now I came to you in power. I didn't come to you giving you fancy, dancy words. I came to you in power. I came to you in spirit. In other words, I came to you with miracles and signs, mighty deeds, which is another word for miracles, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first thing. But that's just internal evidence. What Meyer and we have a movement called A Third Quest for the Historical Jesus. And of course, Wright is a part of it, Meyer's a part of it, Richard Bauckham is a part of it. All these guys are really important historical exegetes at all the best, University of Harvard, Cambridge, et cetera. They're all there. And all of them have one thing in common. You could never explain the exponential growth of Christianity. You could never explain that without some sort of transcendent proof / action. because there's just no way. First of all, humiliating death of the Messiah. All other messianic groups wipe out. Number 3, active persecution for 240 years. And the church is exponentially, not just growing arithmetically, but growing exponentially while it's being actively persecuted. There's got to be something more, says Meyer and Wright and the Bacchum. There has to be something which is causing these people to go, I'm going to endure persecution. He really is risen as he promised. I don't think they're lying at all, because I don't think God would be performing miracles in the name of Jesus when they're lying about Jesus through their hands. I don't think so. So that's kind of, they're looking at it going backwards, right? Implicitly, there has to be something to explain such a grandiose historical anomaly, right? There's just got to be something. And so that's the something, is the miracles and the fact of the resurrection. So that's one of Wright's approaches. But Wright has a second approach in a masterful work called The Resurrection of the Son of God. This excellent book, if people have the patience. Unfortunately, Wright tends to write books that are worse than mine. Over 800 pages. And I mean, if you think I have footnotes, this is like
Is there a
triple.
good Cliff Notes version of that guy?
Well, yeah. I wrote a Cliff Notes version of it. Yeah.
And God yours is only 500 pages.
No. My Cliff Notes version is just 30. I wrote it in a book called God So Loved the World.
And is that at magiscenter.com?
Yeah, magiscenter.com.
Okay, there you go, guys.
Yeah. So anyway, I gave the Cliff Notes version. It's kind of it's heavy-duty Cliff Notes. It's got some footnotes. But nevertheless, getting back to the fact of the matter, he says, if you look at the Christian church originally, the Christian church wanted to stay really, really close to what's called Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism is an implicit set of doctrines that kind of got worked out during the time of the Second Temple. So right after the exile, we're talking about, around, the 590s or so, and going all the way until 70 AD, which is basically the destruction of the Second Temple. During that time, there are all kinds of Jewish doctrines that were worked out. And it was kind of an implicit set of doctrines. It's not like formalized like we do in the Catholic Church, but it's out there. And the Christian church in its initial moments always thought Jesus wanted to remain doctrinally close to the Jewish religion, except for where Jesus explicitly disagreed or showed things to be different. Well, there's not many of those things, but one of them is the resurrection. See, in the Jewish church, at the time, the resurrection was considered a very, I'll just refer to it as a synagogue. The resurrection was a very peripheral doctrine, right? So there are many doctrines. This is kind of out in the periphery.
It wasn't necessary for the Messiah of the Jews to be resurrected from the dead. And he might not even be killed.
Yeah,
right?
and not only that, your resurrection was kind of like on the periphery. But notice what happens when Christianity comes along. They put it smack dab in the center, where Paul says, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, and your faith is in vain, our preaching is worthless, and all those who have died have died in Christ have died in their sins, and what's worse, we emerge as perjurers before God. We're the most pitiable of all men. Well, that puts it smack dab in the center, I'd say. The most foundational doctrine that there is, upon which the entirety of the apostolic preaching hangs. So when you get to that point, you have to ask yourself, why did the Christians do it? Because the Christians saw the risen Jesus, and they knew right then and there everything he said was true. They saw the risen Jesus, and they knew right then and there, he's not just a risen, resuscitated body. He is the risen Lord, Estin HaKurios. He is the Lord. The Lord is the Greek, HaKurios, Greek translation for the Hebrew divine name, Yahweh, Adonai. So that's the first thing. But more than that, there are all kinds of other departures in the resurrection area from what the Jewish synagogue had thought. For example, in the synagogue, they thought that, the Pharisees, of course, believed in the resurrection, but the Sadducees did not. But the Pharisees who believed thought the resurrection would just be like a resuscitated physical body, like a resuscitated corpse. We'd all come back, and we'd have a really long-lasting physical body. St. Paul and all the other apostles insist otherwise. They say, no, it will be a pneumatikon soma, a spiritual body. And Paul insists it's not going to be something physical. You're raised in a material. You're going to be. You were dyed material. You're going to be raised immaterial and spiritual. You died, powerless. You're going to be raised in power, and you're going to be raised in glory. He's referring to something. Paul says later in 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to be like him as he is. So the idea that's going on there says Wright, the thing you can't miss is that the spiritual, that the Christians thought it was not just going to be raised as a spiritual body, but also a powerful and glorious transformed body, just like that of Jesus. And Wright asked the question, hey, if the Christian church wanted to remain so close to Second Temple Judaism, why did it pick that to disagree with? What was it about Jesus' preaching or Jesus' actions post-resurrection that led them to say, no, their doctrine is wrong, our doctrine is right, that they departed from the Second Temple Judaism, which they did not want to depart from. Then he goes on, he says, there's a third thing. The whole idea that the parousia is imminent, right? So that, in other words, the parousia has been initiated.
The parousia?
The end of the world. The end times are upon us. That is to say, the end of the world, let's put it that way. And so all of a sudden you see this in every Christian sector. The parousia has already been initiated. Whatever gave them that idea when it was thought that the parousia is not going to happen till far-flung future? Where did they get that from? They saw the risen Jesus, and they believed by the messianic prophecies that, of course, the end time was initiated, the parousia was initiated. That's why they departed from Second Temple Judaism. But you can go right down the line, and Wright lists about 7 of these areas where the Christian church departs from the view of the resurrection of the Jewish synagogue and reshapes it completely, for no apparent reason other than they saw the risen Christ in glory, just the way he's described in the Gospels. So that's the second major method, is the 2 Wright approaches, that what we call the Christian mutations of Second Temple Judaism, and it's specifically with respect to the Messiah and to the resurrection, but also the exponential growth of Christian messianism in the face of 240 years of persecution. There's got to be some explanation for an anomaly of that huge, grandiose scope. So that's the second method. The third method is on the Shroud of Turin. There is truly scientifically accessible evidence for the resurrection as well.
There's scientifically accessible evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, on the Shroud of Turin. Yes, there is.
What is that?
Well, okay, first of all, maybe for your listeners, the Shroud of Turin is a relic that of the supposed burial cloth of Jesus. It came under scientific scrutiny about 150 years ago when Secunda Pia started taking the first photographs.
So this is a physical cloth.
Yes.
That exists today, and you say it's a relic. There's evidence or some sort of documentation that would suggest or maybe show clearly that this is actually the burial cloth used on Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago?
Yep. I mean,
how do we know that?
Well, I'm going to give a little talk here. It may take about just 10 minutes just to listen, because it's, for one, the Shroud of Turin is the most unique image that has ever been produced in history. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And secondly, it's by far the most scientifically tested historical artifact in history. So we have to look at, well, why did that happen? The first thing is that it's, let's face it, the image is a complete quandary. It is a perfect three-dimensional, I'll talk about that in a moment, a photographic negative image that's emblazoned on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. Nothing like it in the history of humankind. And we'll talk about the sources of that imagery in just a moment. The second thing that's very interesting about the shroud is not just the production of the image itself, but it's also the fact that there's 372 bloodstains on that shroud. They are all authentic blood. Anybody who tries to tell you it's paint or dyes or rubs or something else is just dead wrong. I mean, let's face it, paint and dyes and rubs don't have AB blood type. They don't have human immunoglobulins. They don't have human hemoglobin. They don't have human bilirubin. They don't have another 30 other constituents of human blood embedded in the paints and the dyes. I mean, it's blood.
And that's been scientifically tested.
Scientifically
repeatedly.
Validated again and again and again.
It's real blood on that piece of linen cloth.
Yes. 8 consecutive excellent studies by 8.
And it's the same blood from the same person.
Yes, it is the same blood from the same person. And not only that, that blood, when you see it in correspondence with the image on the shroud, it manifests truly the unique crucifixion of Jesus like nothing you have ever seen, even in ways completely unpredictable to a forger. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. But for the moment, let's just say those 372 bloodstains really verify that the crucifixion of Jesus is so unique. And this definitely was the crucifixion of a man that was identical to that described in the gospel narratives. I'll explain that in just 1 minute as well. There's a third thing that's very important, and that's the dating tests that have been performed. Needless to say, when you have an artifact like this, you absolutely want the dating evidence to be completely solid. Well, in 1988, a carbon dating was done that basically dated the shroud to about 700 years ago, between 1250 to 1350 AD. Well, that would put it way out of the range of the first century. So a lot of people thought, well, gee, this is automatically debunked, and everybody was just, let's call it a day. It was debunked. But then in 1998, they took this the piece of the shroud that was removed from the cloth for the sample, right? They took it from a very controversial site, right in a corner that was burned during the fire of Chambéry in the 1500s. And when it was burned, basically the sisters in 1500 took cotton fibers and interwove it in a process called invisible mending, and wove it into the shroud to patch up the holes from the fire. Now, that automatically means that there's going to be variability and heterogeneity in any kind of carbon sample. So anyway, Dr. Ray Rogers, a very prestigious thermochemist here at Los Alamos Labs, he's now deceased. But at the time, in 1998, 10 years after the 1988 carbon dating, he said, this sample can't possibly be right.
So they carbon dated the sample that had been kind of manipulated by these nuns after the fire.
That's the sample
where they got the sample.
took.
Okay.
And then he verified it. So Roger said, I'm getting some sticky tapes from that exact area from the 1978 Stirrup investigation. I'm taking some sticky tapes from those areas, and I'm going to do chemical pyrolysis. I'm going to do mass spectrometry. I'm going to do a bunch of other what we call thermochemical tests. Then he comes out in 1998 in the Analecta Thermochimica, which is a very prestigious thermochemical journal, which he was the editor of. By the way, for many years he had been the editor of. He puts it in there, and he basically says, look, he says, there's no way in which the sample that was taken could have come from the original shroud. I mean, how can you have cotton fibers? And I mean, the shroud's made of linen. There's no relation chemically to cotton. And cotton fibers, no less, that are dyed with a gum dye mordant that was only available in the Middle Ages in the 12th century or later. So how are you going to explain that?
Why did they do that, Father Spitzer? Why did they take a little piece off the edge as the sample? Is that because to protect the integrity of the larger
that
linen piece?
That ostensibly was the reason, but maybe there are other reasons. And I don't want to say there were people trying to do discrediting actions, but I'll just simply say, man, it's hard for me to believe that that was an unbiased sample, because the protocols originally called for in 1978 required that a sample be taken from 7 spots. To take it from only one very controversial spot that was burned and remended, and then split that sample into 3 parts and give it to 3 labs, it's very, very, very suspicious. I must tell you this. And so I'm just not going to say they were there. I'll go with your ostensible, they wanted to take it from someplace that would not.
So when the new guy is doing the new tests that are the best-in-class tests for carbon dating, are they doing carbon dating now on the whole?
No, they're not going to do it, and I'm going to give you the reason for that in just 1 minute. But there were 4 other tests that immediately showed that the carbon tests were wrong. And I'll tell you why in just a moment, that you can't use carbon dating in the future, because essentially the particle radiation hypothesis shows that what happens is if you've got a neutron flux, and I haven't explained any of this yet, but when you have a neutron flux, what winds up happening is the neutrons will irradiate what's called the N14. N14 is an ingredient in cellulose, which is an ingredient in linen. And so you get an irradiated N14, it turns into C14. Well, C14 is precisely the kind of carbon that's measured in a C14 dating test. So when Dr. Arthur Lind in this country discovered this, he said, look, you cannot use a carbon dating. There's, if there really was a neutron flux, which produced this thing, a flow of neutrons that left the body, and I'll explain in a moment, then there's just no way you could be testing for C14, because there's too much N14 in the linen that could get, turned into C14. But 4 other tests were developed in the meantime. The first was a Fourier-transformed infrared spectroscopy. The second one was a Raman laser spectroscopy. And the next one was a mechanical compressibility and tension test. Now, these were done by Giulio Fanti and his team at the Italian National Labs, and very reputable, good people. They basically showed conclusively that the cloth, on the basis of these 3 tests, which are really not affected by a fire like a Chambéry or getting burned and having heterogeneous material, and so it's not affected by carbon. So they put these 3 tests together and came up with an age of 90 AD, plus or minus 200 years, with a 95% confidence level.
Wow.
Then came Dr. Liberato Di Caro and his huge team, again, another team at Italian National Labs, And they put together a new kind of testing, very accurate, refined testing, peer-reviewed over 3 years, called wide-angle X-ray scattering test. Now, after the peer review testing and the acceptance of the test as valid, then they took a sample from the shroud and dated the shroud to between 54 AD to 75 AD. So like mid-1st century. Hello, within spitting distance of Jesus with a very small error, margin of error and a very high, again, 95% level confidence level.
And Father Spitzer, I know, forgive me to interrupt here, but there's so many questions that are already firing off. And I know you're going to be answering some of them already, but we know because of the linen and because of the crucifixion, and you're going to get into the details of the kind of crucifixion it was that's represented on the cloth, but that this is from the area, largely, of where we know Jesus Christ's crucifixion to have taken place.
Yes.
From the Roman Empire and that particular part of the Roman Empire where the crucifixion was, because of the kind of linen it was. I'm asking as a question here.
Yes. Well, that's part of the reason. But the real clue is the pollen grains that are embedded in the shroud. So there's a whole science around pollen grains. And so there's very specific regions in which pollen can kind of breed, and there are what we call indigenous pollens, and then we call it unique pollens, and then there are more universal pollens. Well, if you look at the pollen grains embedded in the shroud, by far, 2/3 of the pollens ingrained in the shroud come from the northern Judea and Jerusalem areas.
Wow.
So, and not only that, 14 of them are indigenous to that region, and 5 of them are unique to that region, never found anywhere beyond northern Judea. Now, there's only one way to explain that, and that is that cloth had to be in that area for at least 300 years in the open air. That's how you're going to get that abundance of pollen grains there. No medieval forger could have produced this without taking back the shroud into Jerusalem and leaving it around for a few hundred years to get these pollen grains embedded. So there cannot be any doubt that the origin place, the longest place of exposure to the open air, has to be Jerusalem, northern Judea. That's the first thing. Then we find the next largest group is Edessa, Turkey. By the way, Max Frey was the one who originally did this, the great Swiss biologist and criminologist. But now that this has been repeated by many, many other experts in many other countries and found to be correct, that what I'm telling you now is pretty much accepted by mainstream scientists. So the main thing to remember, though, is second group is Edessa, Turkey, and we know that from other reasons, and we can talk about later, that the shroud was in Edessa. It was called the Mandylion there, the face of Jesus. But we know it was there. We can see it because of the changes in Jesus' iconography that happened specifically at that spot. And lo and behold, there it is. We can see. So
paintings of Jesus, drawings of Jesus to worship him by Christians were done differently once they were introduced to the shroud in Edessa.
That's correct.
We have this as a part of the historical record. So what you're basically describing is there's all these clues about this cloth that's clearly from about 2,000 years ago, and these clues are leading us to a conclusion.
That's correct. So anyway, the next one
Why
is
do
Constantinople.
so few people know about the Shroud of Turin?
I'm sorry?
Why do so few people know about the Shroud of Turin?
Well, I think it's two reasons, really. The first is so much of the research has been done is scientific. And unless you're reading science journals about this, or somebody like me has clued you into this, and I've got I have another book coming out from Ignatius Press in August called Science at the Doorstep to Christ. I have a 50-page chapter in there called Science and the Shroud of Turin, Science at the Doorstep to Jesus. But I'm trying to make it available as much as I can. I talk about it as much as I can. And now there are a lot of people who are really getting out there in the popular press trying to do this. But that darn 1988 carbon dating set everybody on edge.
Meaning at the time there was some excitement that, this could be the burial cloth of Jesus, is going to teach us something. And then it was discredited because of this one test, and people have written it off since.
That is correct. And
what a tragedy.
It's a total tragedy because it was a bunko test. And now it has been I'm telling you, Tristan Casabianca and his team basically begged for what's called the statistical raw data, the statistically analyzable raw data from the carbon-14 dating process from the 3 labs. Just give us the raw data. Just give us the raw data. And from 1988, the British Museum, who held on to the raw data, would not give the raw data to anyone. And then finally, in 2018, 30 years later, what happens? Basically, they appealed on a Freedom of Information Act to the British Museum and just say, you have no right to withhold this data from us. And finally, of course, they gave it to Casabianca and his team. They showed immediately from a cursory statistical analysis, could not have been doubted, that there was so much heterogeneity, stratification, and variegation between the different parts of the sample and within each part of the sample that it couldn't possibly be dating a single material from a single era. There has to be a mix, in other words, of ages and a mix of materials that should have been very evident from the very beginning.
EveryLife.com is America's fastest growing diaper company, and they're also America's pro-life diaper company. These products are high quality premium baby products that are great for your little one's skin, and they also support the pro-life movement by donating money back to support mothers and babies in need. You can join a subscription service and get your diapers and wipes sent directly to your door. Check out their products. They're awesome. They're better than Pampers or Huggies or these competitors. And Pampers and Huggies and many of these competitors are pro-abortion companies that support abortion. EveryLife, on the other hand, has awesome products at a great price point and supports our values and supports children. So go to everylife.com today. You can use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order and get the best products for your little one. That's everylife.com. So it sounds like, setting aside what you just described about why that one carbon test was bunk, there have been multiple tests by very prestigious institutions and individuals to prove the dating, the placing, like geographic placement of where this originates, this material, this linen cloth. I want to hear why we know, those are clues, but why we know that it is miraculous and what we know about Jesus specifically from the cloth.
Okay, let me do the last one first and the first one last. So let's start with the Jesus part and why we know it's Jesus, and then look at the image itself.
And where is the shroud now? Sorry to interrupt you.
It's in Turin, Italy. And
people can go see it.
And you can't. You can go see the box, this big metallic box where it's stored, and you could pray there in front of it. But an exposition happens only now and again. And this will be relevant to some of the remarks I'll make in a few minutes. But the main thing right now is you could go pray in front of it. And I'm telling you, this is the burial cloth of Jesus, but I'm going to give you the evidence that I'm using no scientific truth can be 100% certain, but I'm 99.9% certain. This is it, and I'll give you my 8 major reasons why right now. First of all, let's go back to the blood. Now, the blood is sitting there on the image, but we know what produced the image is basically we can detect friability, a crispiness in the cloth, an exceedingly precise crispiness that goes along what we'll call radiation sites. But the main thing to remember is that I can detect whether that crispiness is on top of the blood or underneath the blood? Now, that's very important because the question arises, what came first, the blood or the image? Let's suppose it's an authentic shroud. Then, of course, the blood would come onto the shroud. Well, the minute that body's laid on the shroud, the blood would be on the shroud already. And then the image would come later. That would mean that there should be no crispiness, no friability of the cloth underneath the blood. And there isn't. The blood came first. Now, can you imagine trying to put all the placement of the blood on that cloth and then put the image on top of it? So a forger goes backwards.
We're going to maybe put up a picture during the podcast so people can see those that are watching on YouTube. But when you're saying the image and the blood, doesn't the blood marks make up the image? Or you're saying there's an additional image? There's
an additional image
alongside the blood that is supernatural?
Oh, yes. And that image is produced by radiation. And what I will talk about later is the difference between ultraviolet radiation and particle radiation. I definitely favor the particle radiation hypothesis. But, I mean, that's... So
the idea here is that God, Jesus, left a supernatural, miraculous image on this cloth.
Yes.
To prove what?
To prove that he was risen from the dead.
And prove that he was risen from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, I'll just skip to the end for just a second here. Basically, that image is very, very probably produced by what we call a low-temperature nuclear reaction that occurs from the simultaneous disintegration of every stable atomic nucleus in that body. Now, you look at that and you go, wait a minute here. You know, how many atomic nuclei do you have in that body? 7 octillion. That's like a trillion. And all of them simultaneously, and their perfect stability, underwent disintegration the same time. Are you kidding me? You know the odds of that happening? Monkey typing, half of a Hamlet perfectly by random tapping of the keys in a single try. That ain't going to happen under any naturalistic physical scenario. Yet I would propose, and I think I can prove to you, that's exactly what happened. It is none other than a miracle in which God literally allows the entire body to disintegrate. But the particles that are coming off that disintegration, in other words, the proton-deuteron flux, which is a flow of protons and deuteron, heavy charged particles, and the heavy neutral particles like neutrons, 2 fluxes are coming off, right? And the proton-deuteron flux is embedding itself in the image, causing the picture, the crispiness, the friability, the perfect 3-dimensional photographic negative image emblazoned on the non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. And the neutrons are explaining, they're going through the cloth and doing a whole lot of other things that need a whole lot of explanation. But at the same time, literally, Jesus is leaving us the particles of his body embedded in the cloth, which has produced this picture. So as his body's moving from a physical body to a spiritual body, the particle remnants, as he moves to that spiritual body, that glorious body, the particle remnants are literally embedded in the cloth, leaving us the imprint of his image.
So we have, what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is we have remnants of Jesus's resurrected body, a supernatural body, but still his body, on the Shroud of Turin.
Well, it's also his physical body. I mean, so as his physical body's transitioning, those particles are coming from his physical body.
Well, we have the blood from the crucified body.
And we have the blood as well.
So we have the whole body represented here, and the whole story, the whole drama of what took place.
You are very right. And so to make, again, a long story short, the coordination between that blood and that image constituted by the particles of his body, the very coordination of it is uncannily similar, almost identical to the gospel narratives described, to the unique crucifixion of Jesus described in the gospel narratives.
Explain, walk us through that.
Okay, so here's the main thing. Remember now, blood first, That's what you'd expect. Then image second. The radiation comes second from the low temperature nuclear reaction. Okay, so you're going to have a boom and a light too. I'll just say that as well. But let's go through the crucifixion evidence first. So first, let's just take the crown of thorns. We have only one known crucifixion in the entire history of crucifixions. Only one man was crucified with a crown of thorns. And that was Jesus, because Jesus was accused of calling himself King of the Jews. Makes sense for him. Didn't make sense for anybody else. But the man in that shroud definitely was crucified with a crown of thorns. And not only that, but the thorn that was used in the crown is called called a Syrian Christ thorn, a very long curved thorn that embeds itself not only in the side but on the top of the head, causing a considerable pain and emitting multiple wounds that actually penetrate into the nerves in the skull and the flesh that's surrounding the skull. Terribly painful. But a Syrian Christ thorn, just saying, like the pollen grains, comes from that region of northern Judea and Jerusalem. Second thing is, you can see between the fifth and the sixth ribs, you can see a wound. Of course, the Gospels describe that a spear was thrust into Jesus's side, and out flowed blood and water. Remember John's gospel. And he's so defensive about it. He says, this is seen by witness, and his witness is true. So, of course, he's insisting, I saw not just blood, I saw water flying, coming out of it. Now, of course, this is a unique event. Again, we don't have spear wounds in crucifixion, in the history of crucifixion, because that would have put a guy out of his misery sooner. But remember, Jesus is already dead. The Passover was approaching. They just wanted to do it as a check. They weren't putting him out of his misery. They never would have done it, and they never did it in the history of crucifixion.
And when you say they wanted to do it as a check, it's because, in part, they didn't want him to accidentally be somehow rescued alive.
Exactly.
And then this thing they were trying to quash Christianity would bubble up even more fiercely because, he's resurrected now.
You're right on the marker. And not only that, but now the shroud really shows this is exactly what happened. You can actually see the spear wound. It's an elliptical spear wound, just like the ones that were used by the legionnaires in Rome. It goes between the fifth and the sixth rib, up at a 30-degree angle into the thoracic cavity, nicks the heart, and then keeps on going up to the pulmonary cavity. And there, remember, the pulmonary cavity is filling up with a transparent fluid, kind of looks like water, but it's filling up because the man has to lift himself up in order to breathe. So now the pulmonary cavity is filled with the water. It hits the pulmonary cavity, but when it nicked the heart, the blood from the heart squirts out, and then the pulmonary fluid looks transparent like water, squirts out right afterward. And if you look at that wound, that's exactly what happened. You see the blood in the center. You see the pulmonary, the pleural fluid surrounding it right between the fifth and sixth ribs where the spear wound obviously was. I mean, anatomically, it is perfect. And we have, Buckner, it started with Barbette, who identified it. Then, of course, Buckner, and then a series like Zugabe and a series of other histopathologists have examined this over and over and over again. No question about it. Outflowed blood and a transparent fluid, just like the Gospels say. Then the third thing that we see is the whipping, the flagellation that took place. Now, in this case, we can tell right away Jesus has, he's whipped 39 times, but with the whips, the Roman whips, see the medieval whips only had one strand, but the Roman whips had 3 strands. And they, maybe about 2.5 feet long, and they had little lead dumbbells at the end. And those dumbbells would grip onto the side of the man being whipped. And then when they pulled it out, they would pull it out so that it would shred the flesh along the man's neck or back or shoulders or thighs or whatever was getting whipped. Now, there was a guy to the right of Jesus and a guy to the left of Jesus. The guy to the right's a little taller than the guy on the left, but they are whipping away on him. And so he's left with all of these shredding of the flesh wounds from this whipping, and he is losing major blood. You can see that, and you can see that this blood loss is going to explain why Jesus dies so quickly. Normally, crucifixions could last not only an entire day, but could actually last for 2 entire days or more, where the person is just suffering in agony until finally he cannot lift himself to breathe anymore and endure the torture. But in Jesus' case, he was dead after 3 hours, according to the scriptures. And that would make sense. There's a tremendous amount of blood loss there. And by the way, this is a Roman whip. This is not a medieval whip, something that was invented by fortune. We didn't have, it's called a flagrum. We had no evidence of a flagrum until we discovered, it at Pompeii and other archaeological sites. But the main thing that's important here is the whip is Roman. And so the elliptical head on the spear is Roman. So it's coming from this area where a forger would have never had opportunity to get the facts right. Then we start looking at other things. For example, we can see that there is a slope to the man's right shoulder. And on that shoulder, it's an 11-degree slope going downward, meaning his shoulder was dislocated. And so we can see in the middle of that slope shoulder a very large contusion there. And so we can also see on the man's knees that there are scrapes. So it looks like the man, obviously, he's carrying a very heavy blunt object on his shoulder. He somehow trips. He lurches forward. And then when he lurches forward, he smashes his knees onto the ground. This heavy object goes up in the air and blam, it smashes his shoulder, dislocating his shoulder, causing the contusion in the middle. Then his head just snaps to the left and pulls his right eye into the right eye orbit. These are all of the things we would expect to find in an accident like this or in a fall like this. And of course, that's exactly what we see on the shroud. Again, the man is tormented. This also explains why they get Simon of Cyrene out on the deal, right? Because they got to have somebody carry him, carry the cross. He can't do it. He's going to be partially paralyzed on his right side. So there's just no way he's going to be able to carry that cross any further. So they got to get some. The Romans didn't get Simon of Cyrene because they felt sorry for Jesus. Romans didn't feel sorry for anybody. The basic thing is they want to torment him as much as possible, but Jesus couldn't do the job. So they basically get this guy from the fields. Then you look at the piercing in the hands. This is really amazing. We only can see the exit wound on the right hand. So we can see, for example, the angle that the nail came out of. And it looks like it's right about here on the wrist. So essentially, when you look at that, Pierre Barbet, who first examined it, thought that they must have put the nail right through the wrist itself instead of through the palm. But in point of fact, that's Zuckerby found out later, that is not, looking at the angle of the exit wound, right? That's not the likely scenario. The likely scenario is that the nail is put right in here at the lower part of the palm. And this is what we call the thenar furrow right here. And there's a little channel that goes down here in the thenar furrow. So the nail gets put in, and the nail follows this track of the thenar furrow and comes right out there. exactly at the angle of the exit wound that we see in Jesus, in the man's hand. So that, again, pretty much looks like this is Jesus by the nail prints, but also we can see to the amount of pain, because there's a complex of nerves right here that, it's unimaginable. Remember, man has to lift himself up to breathe. Well, gosh, it's just like pressing against this complex of nerves, which is shocking him. And by the way, this guy was not nailed to a little, ledge on the cross that's coming out, right? It's his foot is literally nailed to the wood of the cross. So, I mean,
there's no platform, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So there's no way to, and when you talk about breathing, for those happily unfamiliar with crucifixion, which, in the modern era we largely are, but the idea that they can't breathe, they're suffocating because they're hanging. Explain that to people.
Yeah.
That part of the torture of crucifixion.
Yeah. So when you're hanging there, right, the main thing to remember is your diaphragm is fully distended. Well, it's fully distended. You're not going to be able to breathe. Only thing you can do is lift yourself up. You got to pull yourself up.
Ripping against your own flesh.
Ripping against your flesh, going through those nerves. And even the nail ones, they're right through a set of nerves in the ankles, right? And you're going through the heels, so that he is experiencing shock after shock as he's trying to pull himself up. And so essentially the man is being tormented for hours and hours and hours. And of course, he's lost all this blood. So
now, Father Spitzer, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
This is such a sad thing to say. We have about 10 minutes left for the episode.
Better get to the resurrection, eh? Yeah.
I know. So, this should have been a 2 or 3 hour one. This is so incredible. But just to warn you about that, because I'll try not to interrupt too much, because I keep asking all these questions. But yeah, obviously I know there were 8 things you wanted to say.
Oh yeah. Well, suffice to say that this is none other than Jesus Christ. His crucifixion is unique. It's all Roman weaponry that's being used. I mean, the anatomical precision between the blood and the image itself is perfect, even though the blood went first and the image went second. I mean, I have not a single doubt, that the body that lay in that tomb was crucified in exactly the way described in the gospel narratives, so that the gospel narrative validate the shroud, and the shroud validates the gospel narratives. No question in my mind about it. What a perfect parallel. I can't imagine anything else explaining it except the exact gospel account. Let's go to the image itself. The image itself lies, and this is like a photographic negative image, and we'll talk about the three-dimensionality in just a moment. But the one thing to remember is that image is lying on the uppermost surface of the fibrils on the cloth. It never penetrates into the medulla of the fiber or into the middle of the cloth, just the uppermost surface of the fibrils. Now, that's where the crispiness is, as I was calling it. Now, that couldn't have happened because of liquids. If you, let's suppose you're trying to produce that image with a liquid. The liquid would have penetrated the middle of the fiber and to the middle of the cloth, just like that. And not only would it have penetrated in the middle, it would have also, started spangling into adjacent threads and so forth, making the image blurry and so forth. This is an exceedingly precise image, no blurriness at all. And as I said, it's photographic negative. So the first thing to remember is, can't be produced by liquids. Can it be produced by vapors? Maybe there was some aloes that were mixed with the hot body after the crucifixion. producing the vapors, and the vapors kind of moved into the cloth. Maybe that's what did the job. Absolutely no, because of course the vapors are going to penetrate into the middle of the fibers and the middle of the cloth, and it's going to be even worse spangling, even worse spread to the adjacent fibers, more blurriness in the image. The vapor doesn't work at all. How about scorching? It was burned in some way. No. Because we have a very easy test called fluorescing, which will determine very, very quickly that it was not scorched. Okay, so what's left over? Well, we know there's action at a distance. We know that there is inside information from the body. So the backbone inside the body is giving off an image as much as the flesh surrounding that backbone, and in perfect three-dimensional proportionality. So we know the distance from Jesus' backbone, from the man's backbone, to the flesh surrounding it, etc. Okay, now you look at that and you go, what can do this? There is only one explanation: radiation. In fact, another name for radiation is action at a distance. So in other words, radiation can cause something to happen, right, at a distance without having to make contact. So there's a ton of places where the shroud cloth does not make contact with the body, yet the image is there, and it's in perfect three-dimensional proportionality to the places that are in contact with the cloth. And not only that, as I said, the inside of the body is emblazoned on the shroud in perfect three-dimensional proportionality. The black backbone is in perfect proportionality to the flesh surrounding the backbone, etc. So we've got a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative emblazoned on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. Radiation, radiation, radiation. Now I'm going to cut to the chase. There are two hypotheses for what kind of radiation could do this. The first one is the John Jackson hypothesis, very excellent super physicist that this guy and his team have produced a very strong explanation on the basis of what we call vacuum or columnated vacuum ultraviolet radiation. If this theory proves to be the explanation, that would require, Lila, 6 to 8 billion, with a B, billion watts of ultraviolet energy for 1/40 billionth of a second to produce that image. Now, if that were the case, think about that, 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. Well, that's like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy emerging out of that body for 1/40 billionth of a second, producing this snapshot. Let me think now. How many dead bodies produce 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy for 1/40 billionth of a second? Zero, except Jesus, because the cause cannot possibly be naturalistic. By the way, if you tried to produce that image with all the ultraviolet microwave radiation in the entire world today, it would require 14,000 ARF excimer lasers to do that, which is more than all of the capacity we have in the entire world in every laboratory today. How did the medieval forger pull that out? I don't think so. So, I mean, it's obviously a miracle with a capital M. No question about that. So that's a possibility. Here's the problem. There are 42 enigmas on the shroud, and only 21 of them are explained by the ultraviolet radiation hypothesis. And even the information from the backbone, the bones in the hand, the inside of the body, right? All that information is not going to be explained by the ultraviolet radiation hypothesis. A secondary hypothesis, which I'm a believer in, this comes from Jean-Baptiste Renaud over at the Institut Physique in Paris, and Dr. Kitty Little, who's over in the Harwell Laboratories in Great Britain, and also Dr. Arthur Lin, who's here in this country, a very esteemed, all of them very esteemed physicists, came up with another one called the particle radiation hypothesis. I'm going to cut to the chase here. This is basically what the hypothesis says, that at one specific time after the blood has already been embedded on the cloth, at one specific time, what you're going to see is the body is going to undergo complete nuclear disintegration, producing a low-temperature nuclear reaction simultaneously. As I said, the odds of that occurring by pure chance, naturalistically, is about the same odds as monkey typing it, half a Macbeth. Good luck on that. So perfectly in a single try. So good luck on that. That's a miracle if ever there was one. So what happened? Basically, what is conjectured, when the low-temperature nuclear reaction occurred, basically there's a big light and a boom that takes place. After the light, not after, but almost simultaneous with the light and the boom, you've got two fluxes, two flows of particles coming out. Positively charged heavy particles like protons and deuterons, and neutral, right? A non-charged heavy particles called neutrons that are coming out, and some other particles that are there, but just you call it neutrons for the sake of it. The main thing, though, that's happening is it explains all 42 enigmas on the Shroud, every single one of them. And it leaves a remnant which can be tested in the next exposition of the Shroud, next scientific testing of the Shroud, that would actually guarantee that this was the explanation. And to make a long story short, what happens is you got these positively charged heavy particles. They're moving up to the surface of the Shroud. When they move up to the surface, the electrons that are embedded in the linen are going to start reacting with the positively charged particles that are coming, and they stick. Where do they stick? Right at the uppermost surface of the fibrils where the crispiness of the image resides. So that's the precise spot. Now, the neutrons, on the other hand, they're not causing the image. They're going right through the cloth. And we're going to talk about 5 ways in which those neutrons affect the cloth. Let me just give you some of the things that are really important here. We always wondered, if this were a forgery, how could anybody, right? Let's suppose he
Father, it's not a forgery.
I know, but I just give the hypothesis.
Yeah. No. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing what you're saying, and it's mind-blowing that every single Christian, I don't care if you're Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Evangelical, Bible, whatever you call yourself as a Christian, a believer, that you don't know about this and you don't allow this to strengthen your faith and allow this to impassion you to want to share the good news of the resurrection with every single person that you know. Oh, yeah.
And I mean, like I said, it's so convincing. I'm 99.9% sure. Like I said, we could never explain how that cloth could have ever been removed by a human being or mechanical means. Because if you remove the cloth from the dead body where the blood was already adhering, it would segment, fragment, and smear every single blood stain, practically every single blood stain on that cloth. But none of them are smeared, fragmented, and segmented.
So you're saying the cloth was miraculously removed from Jesus?
Exactly. In other words, the body disappeared from underneath it and left the blood perfectly intact. But that's an explanation. Second thing to look at is we always wondered, hey, how could the image be on the inside of from the inside of the body as well as the surface of the body? How could that happen? Well, just think about it for a second. The protons and deuterons that are causing the image, they leave the surface of the body at the same time that the backbone ones, let's say the backbone particles are leaving the backbone. But the backbone ones have more distance to travel. Well, a split-second distance to travel. But notice how then the other ones, the surface ones, are already out of the way. By the time the particles from the backbone are trying to get up, to the surface of the body, notice that they're already, all the other particles that were in front of it, as it were, they're all cleared out. And because they're all cleared out, essentially, they go and they create an image of the backbone as well. So we can explain totally how you can get a perfect image of what's inside the body as well as outside the body with perfect three-dimensional proportionality. We always wondered why the blood stains were bright red. It couldn't be explained by bilirubin alone or something like that. We always wondered, and now we know. Because when you, what we call irradiate blood with neutrons, so if these neutrons are passing, heavy particles passing through this blood, and when they pass through very rapidly, they irradiate the blood. And that irradiation, that lasts for a long time. So, of course, if you put that irradiated blood out in a regular old sunlight, like, say, on an exhibition, it turns bright red. Every single one of those things. Again, we couldn't explain that previously. We always wondered, why is it that the frontal and the dorsal images, right, the dorsal back, frontal is front, and why they are at equal intensities? After all, gravity should act on the body, and so push the shroud of the body down onto the shroud, giving a more precise, clear image. But nay, basically the images are identical intensity. How could this happen? Because in every nuclear reaction, there is truly what we call a vacuum, right? And the vacuum sucks both sides of the cloth toward the center at equal intensities. I mean, I'm talking about every 42 enigmas we could never explain, and all of them are explained by this hypothesis. There's also a definitive test that can be made. In every low temperature nuclear reaction, there are going to be what we call cosmogenic isotopes, that basically like calcium-41 or chlorine-36, which, they never occur in any abundance except near a nuclear reaction or in outer space where you have some novas and supernovas and things. Okay, so the main thing, though, is if we get this cloth and we find any abundance of cosmogenic isotopes in this cloth, I'm telling you, the particle radiation hypothesis is the explanation. So here, in a nutshell, is what I think happened, and I think it had to be produced by God, because you can't have 7 octillions perfectly stable atomic nuclei disintegrating simultaneous without, God doing the work, because it ain't naturalistic.
And what you're about to say is ultimately the scientific explanation for the resurrection of the crucified Jesus Christ.
Well, that's pretty much it. I mean, basically, I think what happened is, as Jesus is lying there with the blood, of course, on his body, etc., what happens is, kaboom, big flash of light. Simultaneously, the protons and deuterons are flying up into, interacting with the electrons in the cloth and producing this three-dimensional photographic negative image right there on the cloth. The neutrons are passing through that cloth and not only making the blood bright red, but they're reinforcing it, right? The neutrons tear all what's called the linear bonds. There's carbonyl bonds in the cloth, and those carbonyl bonds are torn. The linear ones are weak ones. Tear them apart, and they reconfigure them in a crystalline fashion, which is very, very strong. That explains why the shroud is so resistant to solvents, so resistant to age, and so resistant to incessant touching and everything else that's happened to it. And it shows none of the signs of wear and tear because the carbonyl bonds have been almost transformed into crystalline ones from this neutron flux, this neutron discharge. So the main thing to see, though, in all of this is these particles are flying up, and they're leaving us truly not just with a picture, but the picture is constituted by the physical particles that were the residual, as it were, of Jesus' physical body. When those particles are transformed, as it were, integrated into the spiritual body that he becomes, the residual of those particles is embedded right there in that cloth, along with the blood. That leaves, as it were, the remnant of his entire body there, in the picture for us to see, along with his blood, that not only validates that it is really him, but validates the narratives, the gospel narratives about this event, and even validates the spiritual resurrection that's talked about in the scriptures. At the end of the day, Lila, I would just say this. I would say that God planned this 2,000, almost 2,100 years ago. And now that the scientists are finally discovering what wonders the Lord has worked, he's sitting up in heaven with a big smile going, gotcha. And that's the mystery. So that's the third area, the scientific area, which basically corresponds with the N.T. Wright arguments, corresponds with the traditional Pauline legal arguments and other data like that. And of course, the empty tomb is a whole other approach. But really, we've got so much evidence for the resurrection, including, these apostles are out there working miracles in Jesus' name for hundreds of years. What do you think? I think that...
I think I'm a Christian.
Yeah. Preponderance of evidence is pretty good.
My goodness. Thank you, Father Spitzer. I mean, what a gift to the church your explanation is, and to the faithful. And I hope and I pray that this can encourage people in their faith and just fill our hearts with gratitude for what the Lord has done, and that we can share this, because what a treasure salvation is. There's nothing else. It is only the Lord. So thank you, Father Spitzer.
Sure. Maybe next time if I come back.
You better come back.
Eucharistic miracles.
We got to get to that. There's so much here. So thank you, Father. Okay, so I know it's magiscenter.com.
Oh, yeah. Please go to magiscenter.com. Also, go Sophia Institute for Teachers if you're interested in our high school and middle school curricula. And also, if you want to pick up a book, pick up Science at the Doorstep to God, which is out right now, and coming up in August, Science at the Doorstep to Christ, both Ignatius Press. Thank you.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Father Spitzer. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. As always, it was a delight to have Father Spitzer here in studio, and we look forward to having him back again. As always, send me your thoughts. You can email me at lila@gtbmedia.com, lila@gtbmedia.com. I love to hear from you guys. Let me know what you want me to ask Father Spitzer about next time. He's a wealth of knowledge, and let me know any other guest ideas or topic ideas that you'd like to see covered on the podcast. As usual, don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to us on YouTube, and support the show through Patreon and Locals. The links are in the bio. This will help the podcast reach more people. Thanks so much, and have a very blessed Easter.